So, welcome. I think I know almost all of you, maybe one or two faces I don't know. I'm Danita Tetsky, jointly down in the libraries and up here. Notice my directions, up here with on the faculty with
That's for my
CCI, right. Anyway, I was asked, and it's a great honor to be able to welcome our speaker today. This is a series that we bring in various people to talk about and lead discussion, share your thoughts of topics that are of interest. Now to a broader scope with computing and informatics. But I'm particularly pleased that we have a genuine librarian in our midst. But if you read his resume, which, so before today's announcement, I didn't know that anything went out, and whoever put this together from the office basically took all the things I highlighted to say. So I thought, what else can I tell you about Eric? If you read the announcement today, you know that he is currently the executive director of the Center for Biomedical Informatics and the Countway Library of Medicine at Harvard Medical School. And before that, he's done all these interesting things at U.S. Food and Drug Administration, where he authored, I don't think this was put in, the first IT strategic plan for FDA, and was responsible for modernizing and enhancing the IT capabilities, as well as the in silico scientific capabilities at FDA, which I'm not quite sure what that means, but maybe you'll tell us. All sorts of wonderful editorial boards and publishing. Prior to that, he was worked at Johnson Johnson, as he was just telling us, traveling us all over the world to go to work, and various other groups, but you've already read about this. But I think you would have caught, too, that he is a dragon, having his PhD in chemical and biochemical engineering from Drexel, and also holding a B.S. chemistry and M.S. degrees in chemical engineering. His research interests, which I don't think were brought out, are enterprise knowledge management, patient stratification, healthcare IT, and translational informatics with a specific focus on pre-competitive data sharing, risk-based analytics, and open source systems globalization. And clearly he writes wonderful, long, full sentences with a lot of meat to them. I think it was mentioned here, but perhaps not in the bio, but since he brought it up, I think this is an added piece of the amazing background. He is a late-stage kidney cancer survivor, and partly coming out of that, an avid patient advocate, serving as the chairman of the Survival Advisory Board at the Cancer Institute of New Jersey, and chief information officer of the King Hussein's Institute of Biotechnology and Cancer in Mount Jordan, and various other groups that he's worked on. And if that's not enough, the one final piece that he offered to share with you that wasn't picked up, some of his personal interests include sailboat racing, backcountry snowboarding, rock climbing, cycling, triathlons, marathons, and operating his family vineyard and winery. So he actually lives in Doylestown, Pennsylvania, here with his wife and daughter, and commutes up to Boston. So it's a great pleasure that we welcome you here. Thank you.
Thanks for coming. So we've got a great deal of time, so I'll try to give you a gift of giving you some time back later. I have prepared some things. Nice small room, nice and informal, so stop me as I go. I'm going to talk a bit of a stream of consciousness through the title here. Before I do, my first question is, how many folks here have a lot of advanced biology or biochemistry in their training? Perfect. It's gonna save me and you a lot of time as I don't go down the wrong holes here. So the scientist survivor perspective is that having been a late stage renal cancer survivor, as well as spending most of my time in science, you get to see both sides of the gown and both sides of healthcare for what it really is, and both sides of healthcare technology for what it is and what it isn't. But you know, being about half my time, I was at J&J for 13 years. When I left, I had been the CIO for the pharma group. About half the time I was a research scientist, half the time I was doing informatics or wet lab stuff. And it wasn't like I had a really strong preference between the two. It was just whatever looked cool next and whatever they asked me to do. It's like, okay, J&J was a great place for that. But the time when you're an IT guy, you're always getting blamed for something. Because that's sometimes what happens. And I'll get to that in a second. Before I do, having been raised by a single Italian mother with a little Portuguese thrown in for kicks, just to really keep it going, and having been a CIO, I've often worked for folks that have no idea what I do. right? They don't understand data science, they don't understand technology, and I'm not that easy to understand anyway. So there's two women here, Panacea, who allegedly cures everything, and Pandora, who allegedly tears everything up. And often, I know institutions, I've seen people approach technology, they think it's one of these two. They think it's going to fix everything, they think it's good for nothing. The other thing I want to talk about, because as a healthcare scientist, my faculty department is actually at Boston Children's Hospital. I actually see how things really get put to work. Very short cycle between the bench and the bedside and the clinic there. And a lot of discovery is great and it's important. You also want things to be useful depending upon what you're trying to do that day. So one of the things that's changed, I used to sit next to, in the early 2000s, I was at J&J, I was a research scientist, I sat next to this guy who had been a rat doctor for 30 years. This is what he did, he was an in vivo pharmacologist, although he would call himself a rat doctor. And there was literally even a hole between our things where he could like, do this to me if we were annoying each other. And he'd say, hey, you know what you've done to me this week? I'm like, well, I didn't do anything to you, but what did I do? He says, well, you know what, as a biologist, I used to have a lot of insight. If I wanted to study a frog, I watched a frog. I watched what it did, I watched what it ate, where it went, how it made babies. I figured everything out about a frog. You've replaced that insight with all this data I don't understand. All of these different pieces. And it's kind of like these guys crawling all over this elephant and trying to figure out what it is and what it looks like. As opposed to where we'd like to say that you're getting complementary views, not confounding views. There's a little bit of the Panacea and Pandora here in the way you could look at what's going on here with data. And we think, and in a lot of cases it's proving to be a good thing, that you have all these different ways you can think about disease and human health. And they're all the time. The environmental ohm, what's going on, there's all these ohms coming up. But the fact that as you start to break these things down, if you start to stare at it, you might forget what you're studying and why, and you might forget how it's relating to everything else in the system. One of the things I used to say as a cancer survivor one year, I said at AACR is, I haven't asked it lately, but I don't think that cancer is scared of next generation sequencing. I don't think it cares at all about next generation sequencing. In the scheme of things, it's just going to do what cancer does. So having spent a lot of my time on the R&D side of pharmaceuticals, this is a lot of what we did. We'd start with unmet medical need, and then you needed some tools. And then this blue band of stars would be the informaticists, the data scientists that worked in my group. And I'd say, treat them well, give them a cookie every once in a while, be real nice to them, they'd help you figure stuff out. And this is kind of an intentionally, bit of heretical view of the drug discovery and development process. And these are all the different types of data analysis, just a small subset, that goes on in every step. And now you say, well, now I guess I understand why it costs $1 billion to develop a drug if you're actually doing a lot of this stuff and you're doing it iteratively. And so, but it doesn't often go where it is. So for example, they'll talk about, you find a target, you find a compound that works against the target. If it's safe, you start to call it a drug. If it's safe and you call it a drug, you start to put it in humans. You test it in a few humans, it's doing well, you start to test it in more humans, and you start to get to the point where this drug may actually be a solution for a real problem out there, and you move forward. Well, the truth is, and I'll say this as a neophyte regulator as well as a scientist, is that the way we do this is actually a really artificially small experiment. So if I'm going to get a cancer drug approved, I'm not allowed to give it to women of childbearing age, but they get cancer. I'm not allowed to give it to them when I'm starting out. And a lot of other things. So you get in this very narrow bit of science that doesn't represent the population that you actually need to deal with up front. So the fact that this looks like this, I would argue that target discovery happens after you get your license from the FDA and you start putting it into patients, seeing what really is going on with this drug in a real population that hasn't, for all the right reasons, been made artificially small. Sure.
So, in this diagram, what would be the role, or where would the role be for modeling toxicity levels before drug trials?
You would actually start all the way through this quadrant like this. You'd be doing a lot of it in here, both in silico and in vivo.
Okay.
Depending on what it is, as you're getting towards this, you've gone through primates and you're working your way up through the species.
I have a question.
Sure.
I'm not sure it's too soon. So can you talk about the the rare diseases?
Let me get to that. Did you have a specific question, or you just want to make sure I hit on it?
So in terms of process, if it's so expensive, what is the justification to getting?
Let me actually, we had to talk a little bit of talk about this at lunch.
Yep.
So one of our recent grants. We're now the coordinating center for NIH for rare diseases. So this is one of these great stories of NIH doing something well. They created a program where they were trying to look at 50 to 100 really, really rare, like this poor kid's fingers are falling off, rare, really, really sick kids, and it worked so well. They actually discovered and named so many diseases that it was the type of thing where congressmen were calling and saying, well, why didn't you take this person from my district? So the Common Fund threw another $150 million at it and said, there's one in NIH, we want 10 more centers. And so they looked for someone to build and to coordinate and build those centers. We got the grant for that. So it's a growing thing. What's interesting, David and I were talking at lunch a little bit, what's autism? And spectrum disorder and everything like that. And I said, well, one of the PCORI grants that we won is for something called Phelan-McDermid syndrome, which is actually a fairly rare type of mutation that leads to a clear clinical presentation of autism, right? So what's nice about that, and where it gets to be worth it, is if you take something like autism that's not druggable, not directly druggable because there's no biological target, target discovery, there's no biological target to go for, it starts to give you a target. So it helps in disease definition. The other thing that it does, and this is becoming more and more, take a cancer drug. If you can show, for the right reasons, there are accelerated pathways for compassionate care and for rarer cancer, there's smaller populations, they're usually a lot better characterized. You have a lot more idea of what's going on with them, you know, and they usually don't have as many comorbidities. So the strategy is get your drug approved in a small population that's got a really tight biological problem to solve, then build your drug out as line extensions. So go into a small thing and then you're proving it safe, you're proving it works, you're proving it has value. You're possibly, frankly, even getting tax benefits for going after something called an orphan designation or a rare disorder, and you build it. So the rare diseases, I actually think it's a hugely growing strategy that pharma is going after right now. And it's smart because they start off helping somebody. They start off with hundreds of patients in trials, not tens of thousands of patients in trials. $200 million for registry trial versus $1 billion. And if it doesn't work, less people have been affected. Because the other part of this, especially in something like cancer, there's nobody entering a phase 1 cancer clinical trial that has a choice. Let's be really clear about that. I mean, you think about the person at that stage of their life or what they're going through, right? So it's important that you know as much as you can that this might actually help somebody, because these aren't people that have a lot of choices. They're probably at the end of their lives, et cetera. So I think going into these rare niches, you're putting less people at risk of getting the wrong drug, which I think is an important aspect of social medicine as a researcher and as a survivor. So I actually think that informatics has helped healthcare and drugs by not figuring things out. And what I mean by that is, if you look at, and you guys have probably done this more than me, if you look at the literature, very bogus positive in a lot of ways. I have found that, so if you've got a drug that you think works on certain tumors based on animal models, and you're trying to figure out which human tumor do you put it in first, and you've got 6 really smart people sitting around a table with their favorite paper fighting like hell about it, which is welcome to J&J on Tuesday, right? Sometimes that's what happens. What informatics can probably do is help prove why 5 of those papers are probably wrong. It probably can't predict what will work, but usually you can fill in the negative space better that way, based on really going into the models and the things that produce that paper. So usually it's not about proving something that's right, it's usually proving something that's wrong, is how I've seen it work. And primarily it's, what's the disease? Cancer is, we're finding out cancer is many diseases, many forms of even something like a breast cancer, 20, 30, 40 different subtypes of breast cancer. Patient stratifications, which patient may benefit from which treatment? Which patients won't benefit from which treatment? Target identification, what's the lock and key? What is the biological activity that we can try to attack with a drug? Indication selection, what I just said, which cancer? I've got a great thing, it works in the immune system. Should I be going after MS, lupus, psoriatic arthritis, pediatric Crohn's? How do I pick the disease for the drug? And epidemiology, who needs it in the first place? Because I would argue that good science ends up being good social policy if you're helping the maximum number of patients, because the economics end up working that way.
So, because this is a really interesting slide, and I think others in the room will want to drill in on this a little bit too.
Sure.
So I was at a 2-day conference, which makes me an expert on genomics, and trying to bring that closer to clinical practice. That was
sure.
the title of it. And I'll probably get the wrong word, so you'll help me with that. But it turned out that one of the weakest things about the research isn't the data itself; it's the phonology of the data describing it.
Yeah.
And because the words that describe the disease change so much,
yes,
people don't actually agree about it.
Yeah. That's true.
And so actually driving something from something of a theoretical understanding, which 20 years of NIH funding has,
right,
to something that actually can make a difference in specific cases, which is beginning to happen, is in fact impeded by our ability to actually describe what it is.
I'm gonna put in a big plug for librarians right now,
Yeah.
and data scientists and things like that. Just get yourself. But anyway, that's absolutely true. That's why even up here,
Yeah.
the disease definition piece, and probably the fundamental gap you see in this, and we see it across the Charles River between Harvard and the Broad, which is kind of fun. Is there's a lot of folks right now that are taking this. They're starting with the genes, and they're working up to the phenotype or the disease. Where we tend to, because we're the way Harvard works, you have to have your hospital appointment before your academic. We start with the clinic, and we try to work down into the data. So at least we know we're starting with something that might be relevant, as opposed to in the noise of genome-wide type studies. And 6 to 1, half dozen to another, but it's a real basic thing. And I'm going to go into each of these a little bit.
Okay, great.
So cancer classically designed by an organ system. That's going to change. We're learning that basic biology often transcends this. Subtypes within subtypes within subtypes are there. And to the question that we're not looking for blockbusters. All we know is that blockbuster drugs tend to bring higher toxicities with them, because they're probably going on upstream in biology so much that you're probably knocking out a bunch of stuff you don't want to knock out. Now the biology, what I mean by organ systems, if you take one of the ways cancers are described is as whether they're epithelial or not, they're carcinomas if it's from epithelial cells. Well, you may find that the epithelial cells in your digestive tract have more to do with the epithelial cells in your eye or other parts of your body, that those cancers may be more related to the type of cell than they are to the organ where they happen to happen. So that's an example of when you're looking at something and saying that, what would oral cancer have in common with colon cancer? Possibly a lot more than it does with other oral cancers, depending whether it's a smoker or not, or other things like that have gotten in. So the going, the high school biology thing of going, cells, tissues, organs, systems up is still actually very relevant, but it's been broken by the pictures of the elephant I showed. All the different planes of biology have busted that up a little bit. I know it's really simple as a patient. I just want the drug that works for me. It's actually pretty. Which patient respond best to which drug and why? How do you predict the response? It's good economics. It's good medicine. It's good policy. What is the risk of metastasis for different subtypes? Should you treat this one more aggressively or not? One of the things that I'd like to do is, when is it okay not to treat? I actually believe we've made an entire generation of men, currently 75 to 85, incontinent for absolutely no reason. Because right now our health system does not accept not treating. As opposed to someone who's got a little polyp or a little prostate growth or something like that, you're really going to do the seeding, you're really going to do these surgeries on these guys. Even in the most aggressive thing, this cancer might kill them in 10 years. There's something called indolence. It's the idea of knowing what a tumor might do. Is it going to go bad or not? If we could figure out what it might do, that's a real important communications thing to try to figure out. And when is the right policy not to treat? And then what's the best end? What's good look like? Cancer's got this really great blunt instruments. You know what the endpoints in cancer look like? Progression-free survival, time to progression, all of these things. They're actually kind of random, because in a trial, if someone gets hit by a bus, it counts as a death. How many, if you look at cancer, a lot of the fact is most Most cancer is still mostly a disease of older people. You know, so you've got all the other comorbidities, all these of heart disease, vascular disease, diabetes, et cetera, et cetera. How do you know when you're treating the cancer? How do you know what your drug's really doing in the mix there?
And to what extent, what is the state of modeling?
I think in some cases, modeling are getting, some of the areas of modeling are approaching being correlative, which I think is important, relevant, not necessarily predictive. For some basic biology, yes, but it really blows up. So for example, the great modeling problem would be the tumor microenvironment. You know, NIH spends a fortune right now doing a fundamental type of cancer research is called a xenograft. Idea is you take some cancer cells out of a human, you grow up in a dish, it becomes a lump, you stick it under the skin of a rat, you give the drug to a rat, and you see if the cancer dies. There's nothing about what you put under that rat's skin that really resembles cancer. It doesn't have a vasculature. It doesn't have it doesn't have vessels. It doesn't have fibrosis. It doesn't have all of the infrastructure. And if you look at some of the cancers that we've made a lot of headway on, they're actually the liquid tumors, the leukemias, things like that, like the Gleevec story, where you're not dealing with tumor microenvironment, which is a physics problem, which is a mechanical engineering and a physics problem in a lot of ways. Even the biological aspects, but how do you starve it? How do you shut down the blood vessels? Things like that. How do you get to it? And it's actually been, one of the things I think that's been a recognition of that is there's a lot of cancers now where they don't do surgery first anymore because they realize that they're destroying the vasculature that would have brought the medicine to the tumor, you know, in some way. So now they'd rather shrink it back, have a more careful view of it. Drug target identification, really hard to, so asthma, severe asthma, one of the biggest diseases on the planet. There is not a single validated disease-modifying target known for asthma. Not a single one. You know, billions and billions of research in asthma. There's 6, 7, you've got atopic, you've got allergic types, you've got obstructive types. There's different things, but not biologically relevant. Like if I hit that receptor with this antibody, it turns something off. Not in asthma right now. So even in huge populations, you can do that. A lot of words on this one. I won't go to it. I tend to do a lot of words so y'all can have the slides later. But I think the idea here that epidemiology is important. It's a matter of ethics and sociology as much as it's a matter of science. That, you know, we really should be studying problems that matter. We really should be looking at diseases large and small if they're informative. If you figure something out that actually changes something about something's going to do.
So, I mean, once again, to my 2-day expertise in genomics,
sure.
I mean, one of the problems there is that a lot of people are genuinely motivated to contribute their DNA to public databases in the public good.
Yep. But
the problem is what is the population? And what is the population of people that actually contribute their DNA? That seems to be a relatively hard question to understand. In other words, if you took a random sample of that, yes, you can do a random sample of data, but you have no idea what that data, what population of data actually represents. Yeah. And so when is enough, and when do you have enough DNA strains to actually?
Not for a lot. They've actually. There's been papers on this that show that the population of Earth couldn't do it. And to be frank about it, not to do all of it, and that's because there's so many different diseases, and we're subsetting them. Sociologically, it's been very shown that people will donate their stuff. If it's done in the right way, and if they trust it, they'll do it. I'm actually going to get into some of the data sharing things because it actually gets into my own thing. So getting into how do you get people to participate in the system? What does good look like? Ask people in a hospital if they know this stuff, especially if they're in a study. Ask the parents of the patients I work with, the children's, do they know this stuff? Do they know why they're there? Do they know why this will help? Do they know why they were selected? Do they know what's expected of them? Do they know what's going to happen? What about my privacy? Am I getting paid for? What are my rights? What aren't my rights? So there's a very large social piece in this. I'm going to get into how I think this is actually getting very good. I wrote this slide several years ago, and I actually think the situation is so much better than it was when I wrote this slide. So that'll be one of the upsides. For your own thing, if you have not ever really been in the pharma world and understood what the process looks like, this is the one slide that shows up. Kind of shows clinical studies, different pathways, asking for permission to do a drug, running your studies is kind of the regulatory view of drug discovery and development. You know, again, more for your reference, but I'll get into it. But to your point earlier, preclinical, clinical, new drug application review at FDA, EMEA, and all the other agencies. When I was at FDA and when I was asked to come in there, this was one of the publications. I'm going to give you two things you might want to read if you want to understand a lot of what's going on at FDA. This document is one of them, and it's one of these free ones you can pull down. The other is the strategic plan that I wrote. But this really shows what's going to go on in the next 10 years relative to medical product regulation. How is drug development going to change? How is device regulation going to change? How about cyber terror? You know, why did everybody want to know the manufacturer of Dick Cheney's pacemaker? And they really did. And some of these other things. You know, telling the FDA stories, most of them I can't, but the ones I can would still be a couple of fun days. What I can say is a couple of things. One, appreciate your public servants. There's people that go to, really qualified people that go down there and work really hard and get no credit for what they do. And there's amazing work that goes on. The other thing is that we have a lot of regulation mostly because people make mistakes, but then there's a few real bad guys. You know, so most of what I saw there wasn't someone being the devil, or there was a little of that. It was man, that can happen. You know, it's just you could see how a mistake like that could happen. We'll give you an example. A couple years ago, almost at this time, the country was facing almost a 90-day supply of methotrexate for intrathecal injection for kids. You probably saw this in the news in 60 Minutes. This is a cancer drug that is, it's actually a generic drug, methotrexate, but kids have to take it intrathecally. It's injected into their spinal column for certain leukemias, and the preservative is toxic. So there's a certain formulation that was available, and there was less than a 90-day supply, and they had all these parents on TV, CHOP was in it, showing that my kids doesn't get this medicine anymore, they die. So at FDA, you got to find someone in the world that can make it, or someone in the world that can sell it and figure it out. This was a case of there was one company that made this stuff in North Carolina, and doing their own diligence, they found out that they had quality control problems. So they shut themselves down. They called us, they said, we've got this, we got to take ourselves down. They did every single thing right. And yet they were still getting press as causing this drug shortage. You know, and what was even worse about it though is that they had passed every inspection the FDA had ever done on them. So what I want to know is what the hell were you guys looking at? And so that's kind of where the informatics and the data science comes in. Is what are we even looking for? What are the threats and risks? And has compliance become such a burden in healthcare and other industries that it's actually a detriment to quality control? That you're so busy doing compliance that you're not doing risk management and quality management. Good news is everybody got the drug, you know, so you get through it. I can leave, when I leave this deck, I can leave a copy of this document if anyone's interested in what's going on. This is it talks about the different technology. One thing I just said, risk-based analytics, what are you supposed to worry about? 200 ports of entry in the country, 40,000 shipments of food alone a day. The most notice we get for anyone is about 8 hours. Sorry, it's 12 hours. 12, 8, 4, boat, plane, truck, I think. Something called prior notice. We monitor the borders with Customs and Border Protection. And you've got 40,000 shipments, 7 people each, 3 shifts, sitting in a building in Virginia deciding what you inspect. What do you inspect? I mean, how do you figure out what things are most likely to make people sick?
And what are you looking for? And
what are you looking for in the first place? It's you know, we actually did a lot, and we made a lot. At the time, they had no correlation. We did a system called Predict that after about a year showed that if a Predict score was 100 or more, it was correlating with a 15 to 20% violation rate, which was what you want. You only want to find the bad stuff. You don't want to find the good stuff, because food goes bad when it's sitting on the shelves, et cetera. So there's a lot of that type of data, risk-based analytics, threat-based analytics in the document. So switching to today, one of the things that I've been asked to look at, and I'm being funded by the Department of Homeland Security, as well as there's a company called Crico that self-insures all the 18 Harvard hospitals. They were smart enough years ago, they set up an endowment and they self-insured themselves for malpractice. Apparently they had the money. And one of the things I have to look at is, because I've done a lot of work in the medical device and cyber threats and things like that in healthcare, what do you actually do? And you know, Andy gave a great talk on this at UC Davis years ago that said a lot. But you can look at, even in the last year, this was 2010, You look at the different cyber attacks against hospitals and everything like that. And it's, you know, it's a matter of being smart about things. It's a matter of people are worried about compliance, they're worried about HIPAA, they're worried about data getting out, they're worried about someone turning on the lights. I'm much more worried about someone going in and raising everybody's serum potassium value by 1 and not knowing they did it. Because you want to raise hell in a hospital, you can do it really quickly that way. So these things are there, they're very persistent. This last Christmas, we all got hacked. I mean, again, right? So at this point, you know, where else, if you wanted to be a criminal, I'm not saying you do, and I'm not saying I do, but if you wanted to be a criminal, wouldn't you pick a field where 3/4 of the crime are never even reported? You know, I mean, you know, it's, you know, and actually, you know, almost, and half of them aren't even detected that it even happened. You know, it's pretty lucrative for the wrong types of folks. FDA was hacked during the last government shutdown, and it's exactly what you thought it was. It's a matter of public record. They went off protocol. Some contractors did some things they shouldn't have done, and people were ready. You know, you hear about things about network, like how many times something sniffs or pings or hits your network. FDA, 70 to 100,000 times a second. Is you know, so if something goes down for 5 minutes, everybody knows. They all know instantly, you know, the second it happens, etc. So what I'm starting in, you know, one of the things I've been asked to do now is I'm building 2 main areas in what I'm doing. One is healthcare risk-based analytics. This isn't just cyber, this is patient safety. You know, I'm really fascinated to whether a virus can monitor an anesthesia patient better than a physician can. You know, whether some of these hair of the dog treatments and how they could really be applied and what you could be doing with them. And then I still do a lot with medical product discovery, both for the FDA, for the pharma organizations and things like that. So there's a focus in that. Risk-based analytics, identification, mitigation of cyber identifiable healthcare products and healthcare delivery risk. Evidence-based, I'm very fascinated sociologically in this compliance versus quality thing. You know, I think, you know, we're sitting here right now in these hospitals worrying about ICD-10 and ISO in this, and Mars is about to attack. And that's what it's going to look like. It's going to look like, while you were doing this, Mars attacked. And, you know, and they are, and I think so. So there's a lot of awareness. I actually submitted a perspective to NEGN yesterday on this topic. See if it gets in. If not, it will go into patient safety. Also to build a pipeline of people that understand healthcare and understand cyber, which I think is a very necessary thing. And then healthcare delivery risk management. You know, all of you guys see the people riding around town on the Segways? Dean Kamen did that, right? You guys know Dean probably pretty well. His brother Bart, a lot of people don't know, is a pediatric oncologist, one of my mentors that we lost to cancer a few years ago. He treated kids at the Cancer Institute in New Jersey for about 30 years. Great, great guy. Anyway, Dean has got an arm for soldiers. You know, it's truly a bionic arm. Some of you have probably seen this thing. Been tied up at FDA now for 4 years. Tried to break it loose. Last thing I heard, they were literally talking about the fact that under certain conditions in phases of the moon, there's a possibility that one of these guys could get a 12-volt DC shock. I haven't met a military amputee who would care or be scared by that yet. But I think we've got to get down to understanding that technology is advancing faster than we can regulate it, and we've got to find the way to make the right smart call. Because I'm not someone who's against putting things. There's enough snake oil out there already. You don't want to put the other one safe. But you know, if that arm doesn't go through pretty quick, I think we're going to see Dean on 60 Minutes. You know, because it's just too important. So what's going on in the news? Right now, the big thing, y'all, who's heard of PCORI? Huge amounts of money going through some pseudo-governmental thing. We've got about 25 million of it, three of the grants that we're doing ourselves. The idea here is sharing data. And it's what I said earlier. I talked about how many patients it would take to do something. What we don't have, and especially even in big diseases, is adequate data density. Because when you start sorting out, even a trial with 5,000 or 6,000 people, you end up getting down to 200 people that look alike on a particular biological attribute that you can measure. It's not enough people. So the idea of sharing data is actually about building biological data density. The Innovative Medicines initiatives in Europe, I'm going to talk about, do this really, really well. I'll get to that in a minute. So this was a New England Journal perspective, ended up being an IOM panel convened, 3 days in Washington for me back in October to talk about this. Similar, improving patient safety through transparency. Where's the data? What's going on? What should we know? You know, when you literally have 2/3 of hospital employees saying that the hospital probably isn't being transparent enough with patients about really going on, you've got some type of a problem that needs to be addressed. I think I spoke at this one again, an IOM thing on how would you ethically share data? What's the right amount of data to share? How do you do uniform informed consent and a lot of things that go into making data sharing happen? Picori, we talked a little bit about. You know, we're doing several of these. Another IOM workshop. We're busy down there this fall. Folks familiar with the Innovative Medicines Initiative?
I know
A little bit. So this was actually, again, I'm one of these people, if Europe does something better than us, I'm okay saying that. You know, because I think envy is a good strategy for the right things. And what they did there was the EU put up €1 billion, that's a billion with a B, euros, to study huge areas of unmet need. FPA, which is the European Pharmaceutical Manufacturing Association, put up another €1 billion, so €2 billion to study. First disease was finding 5,000 adult and pediatric patients that had asthma severe enough where they would be bronch and you get lung tissue to study. And J&J was in, they sent me over to help figure this out and set up these trials. And it was actually really cool. You had 10 different pharmaceutical companies writing these trials, and you had about 30 different academics all presenting innovative ways to work with the data. And they've actually done some pretty amazing things.
So I mentioned during lunch that several of us in Chalmey was in on the visit. We went out, yeah, you were there. We went out to Johnson & Johnson on a text exchange day, and so one of the voices on the phone, whose name I do, was talking about Europe and J&J's involvement with a consortium in Europe. And it turned out that some of the work we do with J&J and other pharmas in the NSF Center was very similar, but the connection point in J&J bridge point hadn't been recognized.
You were at J&J.
Yeah, just hadn't been recognized.
Yeah.
But it wasn't so much J&J's fault as it was. I wonder if there's not this Europe-U.S. centric world that operate very differently, and when in fact some bigger mechanisms for cooperation leads to bigger results. So it's hard to get NSF money for international purposes. It's not impossible, but it's hard.
Same thing with this.
Yeah. Okay.
One of the things they did with this was actually pretty. Now the funny thing is, and you guys actually are really the ones that suffer here, because you've got this huge consortium. Well, let's face it, all the big pharmas, most of them are based in Europe. Most of them are based in Germany, actually. So the truth is, the only people that aren't getting this data are the American academics, because all the pharmas that are here are in Europe too. So the pharmas have the data. So I mean, and that's so there's definitely a piece on that. But what they try to do is start saying, so now go back to how do you actually do something like this? Well, I had built an open source system called Transmart back in like 2007, 2008. I started putting Johnson & Johnson's clinical trials up on Amazon Public Cloud, de-identified 2007, through the system called Transmart. So IMI, the European Union in Brussels, Michel Goldman, the director, was like, how are you going to show you can do this? Long story short, gentleman, a friend of mine, Yi-K Go at Imperial College, who was one of the founders of Infrasense, if you're familiar with that technology, he put up a cloud hub at Imperial in the late 2000s. We threw Transmart up on his cloud and moved patient data from 5 different pharma companies in it in 60 days. And 90 days later, we went to Brussels and did the demo. So in 2007, you saw all those IOM consortiums that I was talking about happen this fall? Well, 7 years ago, we actually showed the people that want to share this data can't. So it's much more of a social problem usually than a technology problem, but you can actually do this. Not only that, but we built this open source system and gave it away, and it was probably one of the more innovative things J&J had ever done technology-wise. It was me having great bosses at J&J when I said, I'm going to build this open source and give it away to all the other farmers. They went for it. Not only did we do that, this system is now being used to support literally hundreds of millions of dollars of research around the world in almost every disease you can think of. And it's something that we built over here in Radnor and gave away back in 2007. All of these different, the FDA uses it, St. Jude uses it. I mean, it's being used all over the place. But more importantly, Last week, this was in the headlines. Any of you guys see this? J&J is now releasing all of their clinical trials data
Oh, it is.
through the Yale thing. So you can kind of walk what we started back in '06 by throwing up Transmart and starting to share data in Europe, to the fact where you talk about open data, this is where it walks. This is where it really happens. And that they're actually putting this stuff out there so the researchers can look at this data, find discoveries, and by all means bring them to J&J and bring them to someone else. And say, hey, did you look at this? Did you look at that? And I think these are very exciting things, because I think that we're in a situation where sociology is often more of a barrier to what we're doing in the technology.
Couldn't agree more. There's a common conversation every time you go and talk to a corporate research partner. And it's always about the issue of my intellectual property and protecting it. And it always starts there, and sort of getting into pre-competitive data models that they can share with a competitor is a conversation that is days, weeks, years off. So at the last CBDI meeting, we saw two competitors leave the room for 4 hours to talk. And it was Elsevier and Thomson Reuters.
I could see that. By the way, Thomson Reuters is a great friend, and they actually use Transmart for a lot of their stuff. So.
But I mean, it took 2 years, Chame, for those two people or you to actually leave the room to figure out how they could do it.
The content vendors and the publishers are in a totally different place with this too. I mean, that's about as far right as you're going to get in this world. But yeah, well, it's interesting because what I like about IMI was it was actually very simple, and I think the right answers are. IMI is really simple. The biology is free, pharma compete on your molecule. That's a very simple principle. And this is, we saw this with the Mayo Prometheus thing. You can't patent the ability to do a companion diagnostic. We saw this now with the BRCA ruling, and you can't patent my genes, they're mine. If I want to donate them, I should be able to. Right. I actually do free consulting for the Brave Bosom, the women's BRCA group that's trying to get their data back from industry right now, and some bit of an advocate or even a bit of a zealot on that stuff. But I like the idea that the student that might have served our lunch today may have figured out something that's really important that we need. She should have access to the data. And there's plenty, when you've got that drug target, pharma, develop a drug against the target and your IP is there. Or the diagnostic, it's not the biology. And I think that's where society has to go, although I'm still pretty much viewed as a simplicity zealot and a heretic, because I just say, look guys, look at Europe, it kind of works. So that's the next thing I'm going to get into people power, which I think is a huge amending thing in data, people owning their own data. People know Patients Like Me. Have you heard of Patients Like Me? And Jamie and his brother and the amazing things that they've done. This is the idea of building one of the first online communities for patients to share data. Jamie Haywood's a biomedical engineer who lost his brother to ALS, and actually did a documentary on it that won either the Sun or Cannes Film Festival, won one of them. It was an amazing film. If you ever want to see something, it's a great film to watch. But here's this idea, when I talked about numbers, look at what's going on for free. 240,000 patients, 2,000 diseases, 10 communities, 16 bazillion data points, all the free textiles, 30 fewer paper and stuff like that. They're starting to push through. If people talk about people donating their data and making it happen. And you know who's really good at this? Moms. Moms are really good at this, getting this stuff organized and doing it. So we just kicked off, I didn't share the video before I said, Jesse Dillon, Bob Dylan's son from Wondros, we just kicked off at Michael Milken's Partnering for Cure, we picked off something called Patient-Powered Medicine, which is a new open data commons, all diseases, all commerce. Because as much as I do work with Jamie and the guys here, they're great people. They've decided not to do cancer, for example. They have a very specific disease focus. So what about the cancer folks who don't have patients like them? There's not that open place where anybody can bring their data. So, here's your numbers again. Yep. Starting with the population, getting down, how do you get to here? Questions getting harder, numbers going down. Let's face it, there's more people sharing private data on Facebook today than NIH has. If you can find it, and if you want to. So I'm going to switch gears and talk about some of the stuff we're doing with children's. And what I'm going to talk about now, and I'm trying not to use the big data analogy or anything, but people talk about volume of data and velocity of data. I'm going to talk about some of our research about velocity of data that I think is especially fascinating with one of my colleagues, John Brownstein. And I worked with John before Harvard because he was trying to get FDA to start to look at his stuff, and I was a big advocate for it, so that's how we got working together. Canadian University Press Annual Conference. Let's watch Twitter for a while. I motion that nobody else on this bus puke. Attention, CUPs, they're shutting the gala down because too many people are sick. Please let us know if you're feeling ill. There's a mess on the 3rd floor stairs. Don't take the stairs from the basement. Look out for this. Seriously, this is like walking a setup from a zombie horror film or bioterrorism film. Another ambulance in front of the hotel. Resources have arrived at hotel, going room to room, hand out drinks and meds. After 36 hours out reading my hotel room, I'm starting to feel better. Number of foodborne illnesses reported each year in the US. Number reported by Health Map, 10,000, 1,000-fold faster and more. Getting to Facebook and stuff like that in the real, what's going on with epidemiology, and if you're actually watching all of this go on, we can now do medical surveillance so much better, so much more accurately, and so much more minutely, like to the hotel, of where something is going on in these ways. And you know, of course, again, regulation can't keep up, but the rate at which this stuff is going on and the rate at which it's changing. There's one slide in 1996, 167 days from outbreak start to outbreak discovery. 2010, 20 days. So, you know, it went down a lot. It didn't go down that much. One of the things we did at FDA was MedWatcher app. Has anybody ever tried to file an adverse event on a drug with the FDA? You'd remember it. You'd remember it. But when we talk them into doing MedWatcher, even when you clean out the garbage, it gets to be instantly, and that's the important thing. So here would be the problem statement. If data moves like this, right, and if one of those veterans did get a shock from that arm, wouldn't we know about it right away? And wouldn't we be able to very quickly make sure nobody else got hurt? So why do we need such long regulatory cycles if we can intervene now much more quickly? When I went to FDA, I had one question. It's like, how the hell do they know it's the cantaloupe? How do they know it was the cantaloupe? And how do they know it was the cantaloupe in like 36 hours? Cantaloupe from Colorado made all these people sick. And they had actually sequenced the food pathogens to the point where they could almost tell you the farm or the county by which, if they had this genomic variant of this food contaminant, it was Bob. It was somewhere near Bob's place, almost. It was just amazing to me. You know, so again, the science the FDA does is just incredible. The rate at which we're bringing it forward probably isn't fast enough. FDA reporting system, overall mining, Twitter adverse events for MedWatch Social. Kind of looks like people are talking about the same stuff. Before I go there, one other thing I was going to do. There's one chart that I guess I didn't take it up. There's this heat map that he did out of Facebook. And what he did was he did the obesity heat map for Long Island. And then he generated one with Facebook. And the Facebook metric was number of posts a person does about their favorite TV show. And they're the exact same map. You know, and again, is a lot of it garbage data? Probably, but so what? You can go through it, you can get real stuff out of there. You know, if you can quickly find the needle, it's okay.
We do a lot of work in this area, by the way.
Yeah, okay, good.
Afterwards, if you have some time, there are a couple of us here that are going to want to talk to you further, Norm and Jean in particular.
Okay, great.
About some stuff.
You've seen this before. I was going to show this again. I mean,
Yeah.
one of the things I want to say, so one of the more dramatic things that's going on is the American Society of Clinical Oncology is going the next way. Years ago, the Institute of Medicine put out a paper what a learning health system would have to be like. And the idea would be that you're actually, every patient's care has been informed by every other patient that came before them. How much does that happen in cancer today? What % of cancer patients are seen in clinical trials? 3 out of 100. So the way the CEO of the American Society of Clinical Oncology, Alan Lichter, says it is, we are not, in any structured form, learning from 97% of the patients that we see. and no structured form at all. So this is a brief video, really the end of the talk part of my talk, that shows what they're doing and how data and analytics are being done. What's really important about this is, other than a few worthless words from me, these are all practicing physicians talking about this. These aren't data scientists, these aren't informaticists. These are people that are saying, I need this to treat patients, which isn't usually that easy to do. This was at last March at the National Press Club.
So what is CancerLinQ? It starts and ends with
People
the
hear that?
patient in the physician's office. So to be specific, CancerLinQ will compile and analyze data from millions of electronic health records, millions of data points within those records, in any format, coming in real time.
Probably the most exciting component or the news of today is what CancerLinQ will mean for patients. And I look around the room, you know, all of us, every single one of us, our lives will be touched by cancer, whether ourselves or our loved ones.
We now have a functional prototype of CancerLinQ, which includes 100,000 actual patient records to date. So the prototype was built to confirm that it's possible to do this and to show proof of principle. And it has.
Every patient's contributing to the answer. That's a huge change in the way we view cancer medicine, and indeed maybe all of medicine.
It's like talking about going to the moon, okay? Someone's got to do it, and someone has to be first and lead and show it can be done and get all the pieces together. And that's what I find most exciting about ASCA and its initiative, is that these are all the pieces, and they're coming together just the way the theorists like myself said we hope they would.
It's all about how the decisions get made. And I think this is putting the right types of tools into the right people's hands to help to make the decisions that morning that are going to mean so much for those patients down the road.
The American Society of Clinical Oncology, through CancerLinQ, has stepped up to lead this transformation. This is really good news for patients and for all Americans, because actually 1 in 2 men will develop cancer at some point in their lives, and 1 in 3 women will do the same.
This prototype reflects more than a year of formative work. It's required input from the broad oncology community and the IT community, a growing component of what we do, of course, influenced by that group. This proves that what we want to do can be done. And that alone, I think, is the important takeaway message.
I've often been told, doctor, I want you to learn something from my care that will help you in your care of other people. It's almost a perfect form of altruism. Patients really want that. They want us to learn from them so that we can be better doctors.
We believe that ultimately CancerLinQ will provide the entire oncology community with benefit and will allow patients, their caregivers, their oncologists, and the oncology nurses to have more informed conversations about treatment options, including supportive care.
We expect that in the years that follow, we're going to roll out an ever more ambitious version of CancerLinQ that will, in fact, take on all of oncology. This is not obviously a small undertaking for a group like ours, but we think that the interest and the excitement and the enthusiasm is out there.
This is a hugely ambitious project. It's a very bold project. It's a scary project for all of us, but I was really glad to hear a couple of the panelists mention that it is going to be successful because of physician leadership. So I think that this is what's different about this project, and this is why it's going to be successful, because we are the people who sit down with our patients when they're undergoing such a difficult life journey. And I think that that's exciting to me, that as physicians we can lead in a time when so many other people are defining medicine for us and what we can and can't do.
I think when a group like ASCO steps up and does this, everybody needs to listen and follow. Sir.
Any comments about the utility of Watson?
what is your machine doing to me?
The CIO.
Relative to this, does anybody have stock in IBM? No. So I think that something like Watson is an important part of bringing in a hypothesis-free approach. I can tell you that we've had some conversations where IBM has made some statements about helping with this that we felt they should stop making. So I'll leave it at that. But I think this type of thing could be really, really good. I think they really would like to help. I think they'd like to incorporate it. At the same time, I think that as this gets there, I'd love to see the right proposal for them to come in a pro bono way and get access to our data and see if we can partner. So I think it's a great tool. It's just got to be done in the right way.
So I think that was Larry's voice back there. So I'm a former IBMer as well. But we did a tech exchange up in IBM.
Mm-hmm.
Chow Mei, you were there. You were
Yeah.
there? Yeah, you were there too. And so since that visit, they've really pushed cognitive computing, of which Watson is just a piece.
Yep.
And I think really what's interesting about Watson, which is really a query answer system,
Right.
I mean, I think a lot of people claim it does more than that. It's a query answer system. But we really don't understand a lot about questions.
Right.
So I mean, on occasion out at the West Coast at the Almaden Research Center, I asked, well, so how is Watson different from a human being? Well, when I ask you a question, you ask me a question, and I ask you another question.
Right. Yeah, that's right. That's exactly right.
There's an iterative exchange
Yeah.
goes on. Watson doesn't know how to ask questions.
Yeah. It's various forms of recognition, various, I mean.
So what's important there is not to point out what it doesn't do well, but actually to point out what they might mean by cognitive computing, which is actually the human piece of it.
Agreed.
So I've been talking here recently about a Institute for Brain Science.
Mm-hmm.
And by that, I don't just mean the neural electrical network of the brain, I mean the mind as well.
Absolutely.
Because the mind is what happens in a real human being, right?
Mm-hmm.
And we may know more about the electrical wiring of the brain than we will know more, because a lot of money is being poured into that. And we actually know about the cognitive modeling in which the brain is situated. So I do find IBM's catchphrase, and they're always about marketing. So what the stands for. But I do find it interesting in that I think they are trying to figure out how man and machine work.
So I did some really interesting projects in schizophrenia that relate to this, because one of the things about schizophrenics is they tend to stay healthier if you can keep them on their meds. But usually they go through these horrible cycles where they get up. And one of the theories, and I think it's actually pretty good, is cognition has a lot to do, that they start to kind of check out. And we had some innovative projects at J&J, and we actually ran some phase 1 clinical studies and even did some NDAs where you could use a video game or something like a video game to help maintain and improve cognition. So the question is when is a video game session a pharmacological dose?
So we're actually doing something very like that with Shire. So Norm, why don't you talk about Shire?
So it's great stuff.
Yeah.
In fact, we are with kids that are attention deficit, and being able to turn around and support positive behaviors by play games.
Yeah, and I think it's hugely valid. To your point, I think cognition is very cool. So that was my stuff. I tried to go through a lot of things. That's what the person I dealt with said cover. So but I've got a little more time and we'll answer questions about anything.
First of all, thank you very much. I mean, it's very. Well, I have to ask you, because I warned you I was going to ask you this. You've used the words informatics a lot of times.
Yeah.
That's a burning issue to some people here.
Yeah.
And you've used it almost interchangeably with data science, and so on. So why don't you give us your views on
Okay,
any
sure.
of those terms?
So I have a very standard answer, and then I'll get a little bit more descriptive and philosophical. When I was spending my time being schizophrenic between being the CIO and the head of informatics, people would ask me, and these are like accountants, they really don't know, and they'd be like, what do you do? And it's like, well, the way I used to say it is I'd say to them, well, the IT part is 80% technology and 20% data, and the informatics part is 80% data and 20% technology. And I think that's actually reasonable true. I actually do believe that that for me, informatics is all about the data. I think the tool stuff is great. I think it's supportive. I think that's like having good hands in the lab. But without the right hypotheses, without the questions are the rare commodity, and knowing what to do with the insights, I think it's my friend Bob again staring at a frog, and knowing what he's looking at instead of looking at all the. I think Bob's probably still staring at a frog somewhere, but staring at this thing and figuring it out. So I do believe, and one of the things I say in some of these talks is I say, if you start looking, and I gave a similar presentation on some of the Twitter stuff. To the Drug Information Association. They have an annual board of directors retreat. It happens to be in Horsham, and I was their lunch talk. And I did a lot more of that stuff. And they would just really take you as their old-time drug regulators. And I said, the issue is this, as opposed to data in the past having been an aspect of science, data is becoming a really important science in and of itself. And what you're seeing is a science around understanding the data. I think PCORI's like that. In those IOM sessions on PCORI, what was really fun to watch, because I probably tell, I tend to be one of those disruptor innovator types. I tend to walk into a place and say, I never say you're doing it wrong, but by the time I leave, they figured out that I thought they were doing it wrong. Right. But but positively, because I think they can do better and more. Not that I just think it's wrong. And in looking at a lot of what's gone on here and all the talk about how you get people to change, I don't think they get the fact that this is happening so fast. I mean, someone asked me about this type of stuff at the FDA, and I said, it doesn't matter, people are using it today. There's nothing optional about people responding to this data, and they're responding to this data faster than they are to FDA alerts. I said, so you've kind of already lost the race. You shouldn't have this philosophical problem about whether or not you're going to jump into the race. Because it's already gone by. So I think getting to the understanding that the data, that informatics to me is about the data, and I do believe that informatics is data science, and then I think you break down into things under that. I know what we do. The philosophy of the department that I'm in at the moment is that it's all about better translational medicine, and so. It actually, the patient that Zach saw that afternoon actually don't care how cool the software is, or anything like that. When you're sitting, that's not what you're seeing when you're walking through those floors. Having those hospital appointments, really, really matters in the way you view your day, and getting through the fact that some of these things are relevant somewhere, and also that there's the other thing about the data science is I also think it goes to that democratization part of this. Yeah. This open data part of this, where it's like, get the data out there to the people that might have the ideas. Because it's usually not the people with the most initials off their names sitting with titles like mine at some big old school. It's usually folks that have a problem they're trying to solve. So yeah, I'm pretty much a data zealot.
So in this new world that's so dependent on data, how much of this is worth saving? How much of the data, and then how to determine what of that data is worth
all of it's worth saving. It's not all worth spending a lot to save. And so I think this is where the technology things come in, where you can have things that are parked indefinitely in Iron Mountain or something like that pretty cheaply, pull it back when you need it. So I think the rate, like if I'm NSA or someone like that looking at 4 billion or how many billion text messages they are a day, I don't know how much of that is actually worth saving versus what you're seeing, because it may not be worth saving because it might have already happened. It might be history. So
do you imagine that there's probably not as much of a need to preserving that? We recently had some interesting conversations around it, just like, on the level on the campus. And I guess I had a new perspective on it and thinking mechanically, how are we going to help this problem? Is to only save that which is really uniquely necessary, the raw data and the associated documentation that gives that data context. Notebooks on that can replicate your findings, the new knowledge that you've created, and stuff that even it took 2 hours to pump out, another guy can do it just as easily. That has no
So
value.
why don't you tell them about the project that you're and we are doing directly?
Yeah, it's really an interesting question of how on a campus we create an infrastructure that will help the researcher manage their data.
Sure.
To start with, by requirements, but really I think more interestingly, so that
strategically,
and enter the whole e-science world to make it. So lately, that and I must say that this is something I'm just coming into, and I started by being sucked into being overwhelmed by this because there's such hype. This is big data. There's no way in the library you're going to be able to do this. This is an archival case. And now I'm beginning to think there's sort of three kinds of data. At least I can see in my perspective what might be done. And one is this just really save that data at the researcher level that can be evidence for them that somebody else could replicate your findings. Yeah. And if you just start at the end of the research, whether that's a publication, a presentation, wherever the researcher says that's the end of this question. So that's one piece. The other is the whole need to be able to share it during the research process with all your collaborators. And that stuff probably doesn't have to be kept forever, just for the life of that research and let it go. And then the third, which I think is maybe uniquely to an academic setting, but a very interesting way to get at this, is how to look at data as part of the education process to understand the research process. So there's a very interesting, elegantly simple project we're going to try to work with some people at Harvard College. I don't know if you've heard about this. They're a librarian and a statistician. Have worked a few years to understand what data does an undergraduate student need to capture, and the pieces around it that can illustrate that they understand the statistics, not just what to run. And to me, that's a microcosm of what really the fancy researcher needs to. And my question becomes sort of a theoretical question. Do we imagine that someday there is some sort of meta approach of categories of data that really do need to be kept? Or is it going to be all so discipline-based, problem-based, or whatever? I think to start with, we're not there yet, but.
I think it will. I don't know what it will look like, but it will evolve. It's kind of like the literature today, how that's evolved, what we have from journals from 200 years ago, how we've classified it. I think it's similar. I actually think one of the, the downside to all the data is that it can actually be very distracting and confounding. And I think, when I started in drug discovery in the early 90s, it was really the time of windows and microfluidics. So there were a lot of folks that did what we used to call high throughput screening, the ability to make. I worked for a company, we could make 300,000 new chemicals a year that you could test to see if they were drugs. And then they created these machines that could run the biology test, could run the assay to do it. And so you could literally screen, 100,000 samples a day. It still cost you $3 to $7 a well. So you could easily burn $1 million a day. But when I was hired by J&J to come down, they wanted me to show them how to do it smarter. Which compounds should you run? We know we could do them all, but we're creating all this dirty data, lower quality data, I guess, that a lot of scientists didn't think was worth anything, and then we were spending a ton of money. So being able to, it's a little bit like that. I think PCORI's a little bit like that. The example I started to give in it slipped. When you look at these huge PCORI grants, it was really fascinating, being the disruptive guy, to see all these people trying to figure out how they were going to do their research the same way in PCORI. And the answer is you're not. The methodologies, they're not going to work. But how are we going to clean the data? Like, that's the data. You're not getting it. Your new science is this dirty data. That's the point. That's what all this money's going towards. In the nature of patient-reported outcomes. It's really funny. One of the things I co-chair the advisory for CancerLinQ with Amy Abernathy from Duke, and I chair the technology advisory. And so we had some heated debates at one point. And I remember some of the developers arguing with some of the doctors. I remember one of the doctors looking at one of the developers, and he's like, you know what? A big part of what I've learned to do in all my medical trainings is when I see a patient, I'm supposed to ask them how they're feeling that day. And if the system doesn't do that, it's not going to work. And it's like, that was a very wise statement. When you hear one. You may not be smart enough to make it, but you know when you hear. And it was a little bit of that, understanding what's important. And PCORI's supposed to be about asking these patients how they're feeling and what's working for them. And you can see that you can do it with mobile apps. How matters and how to do it. And I think what's happened now is and I'm saying this as one of them, not as someone. There's no way for regulations to keep up right now with what's going on. It's just it's washing over you, and you're going to have more Cayman arms, and you're going to have more of these things where you simply know where science is and regulation is back there, and it falls out of relevance.
So I want to build on the news point a little bit. Say it's related to a new concentration we're probably going to have that's going to deal with data curation. Because it's one thing to generate a lot of data and to save it, but to actually know what it is or how it's created and how it's.
We're doing this. Something.
Yeah, and that's a harder thing, and we're interested in educating the people
to do that. Oh, it's interesting. So we're doing this right now at Countway. So Harvard has 70 libraries. Believe it or not, Harvard has 70 libraries, and they recently did this, paid. I don't know which of the big four it was, but one of them came in and said, do a shared service and save a bunch of money and merge them and all this stuff. And they left, and everybody hates them, and now, we're trying to fix it, right? But I think at the end of the day, it was still probably a pretty smart thing to do. It's just, I've done shared services, and there's a data thing, right? So what's interesting, though, is that a lot of the librarians, they've gone into these services that work across all 70, so it's not there. Now, as you know, and pick up my cousin Greg, who's in one of your master's programs, where a lot of the folks in there are librarians and library service people. The convergence of some of the MIS and some of the library stuff is fine. So I've actually had a lot of the Countway librarians, a lot of them have taken programming, and a lot of them right now for UDN, we're doing all of these new curation things, and it's really a career transformation thing for the ones that are interested. So it's actually, we're doing is an innovation project. Sarah Thomas, who's
I know Sarah.
You know Sarah? She was brought in to fix now the Harvard libraries, and she's awesome, right?
Sarah was at Cornell
right.
for a long time.
Which was
Isn't she awesome?
Yeah, she is.
She's just, so she's definitely helped find a way to do it. She shows up with her backpack, and she's she kind of comes in, and so we're she's all about this, figuring out new ways to do these things.
So I mean, one of the things I've said locally is that we're all, no matter who we all are, we're all going to be data scientists. Even if you're a school librarian, you're going to be a data scientist because you're going to be interpreting the data analytics to some population.
You could argue we already are.
It's
just that we didn't.
Yeah.
We weren't down at your level of data. We were at
just different data. We're doing it now. I mean, now the library of the future is a data hub. What Yale is doing with all these J&J clinical trials, it's content management.
So Chow-Mei, I wanted you to talk a little bit, and you too, but a little bit about what is it we know about what do we know, and I'm really referring to the redaction issue. So why don't you talk a little bit about that?
We did some study about retractions.
About?
Retraction, scientific papers. We're looking at it from this citation point of view.
Right.
We're interested to see what is the distribution of those retracted paper in the overall landscape of the current knowledge publication. How long will it take for the retraction actually happen after how many years? And then we're looking at the citations to see after how many years people are still referring to those studies unknowingly. So interestingly, in the current system, there's no mechanism for you to give you alert. You're citing, you're building work on something already retracted.
I agree. Well, I mean, my early on crap about, because a lot of these guys arguing for their paper, and if you go into those papers and the way people keyword things, the way things go on. I remember when I was doing my dissertation, no one called me on it, but there was this paper from like 1917, and the folks at the library got it for me. Everybody had referenced this paper, and I didn't just want to reference it because they did, and it had nothing to do with what everybody. I mean, to be honest about it, it was one of these things where literally I went to the library, they found it, pulled it, whatever. I got the paper, I'm like, what? Type of thing. But it was one of those things where it had been baked in, and And I don't think people do a lot of stuff on purpose. I just think it's rigor sometimes or other things. But
yeah, and that's one of the reasons we're involved in trying to preserve the raw data. itself, and because, you know, we used to have a scientific method that talked about replication.
Yeah, that's right.
And we kind of don't have that anymore.
And you used to talk about precision,
Yeah.
and be able to apply. Well, I think let's put it this way: if it's data that you pay to generate, you should definitely keep it.
Yeah.
If it's data that you're scraping out of the universe, you've got to think about it. But you know, not all of it,
But I think if it has relevance, that it had some, in the end, that you used it for something that created your new knowledge, then it may be worth it. One of the fact, it was very interesting, because, you know, I'm just sort of starting this thinking in terms of, oh, we have to figure out a way to gather it all and keep it and all this. And he said, that stuff is worthless. And, you know, and it's never going to have the same value in the academic pecking order of tenure review as a work where you have done something with that data.
Not in any of our lifetimes.
Yes, sir.
Nor maybe should it. Nor
We
maybe
have a
should
question
it.
back here.
I was going to say one thing in pharma though is that a lot of the challenges are very retrospective. That you know, there's a lot of times where you sit back and say, I wish we measured something like this, or you know, if we had a clinical trial, wouldn't have been great if we got if we measured this scale or something like that. So there's always sort of that coulda, shoulda, woulda. So thinking of data sharing or data usage that could come back at some point. I mean, it's kind of hard to say.
I mean,
when
one of the
you need
things,
it, but
it's a great point. One of the things we saw with Transmart, for example, was when we put those clinical trials up on Amazon and we had all of the genomics together, and a new paper would come out and say that in this type of autism, this gene is possibly relevant. We had the data, and if that gene happened to have been on the chips we ran, we could instantly go back and ask the question. We didn't know it at the time, but I told David at lunch that one of the things I've also done, and I used to do this all the time as the informatics guys, is that if I was going to offer a clinical team $1 million more for analytics, what would they do? Would they add a dose? Would they add a blood draw? Would they add a time point? Would they add another modality of analysis? And 80% of the time, they didn't know. And it was about understanding of their target. One out of these 5 guys, they could just go, boom, I want this. They were ready for that conversation. Elliot Barnathan at Senecor, he's one of those guys. This guy just thinks more than anybody. He's awesome. But yeah, it's very difficult. But that's why the data density thing in pharma is important, because what questions did go into those other study designs, and do you save money, but more importantly, do you not pull patients into a trial and give them a worthless drug? Because you don't know you're doing something that your competitor already did, which I think is also an important social thing.
I'd like to go back to some of the really exciting things that you were referencing on patients like me and people-powered medicine and so forth.
Yeah.
So I was thinking, I had just sort of a random stream of consciousness, but I was thinking partly about the altruism of being able to donate your data.
It's a big deal.
And so on. We're thinking about Henrietta Lacks, and that was so.
Yep, absolutely.
But I just wondered, as a patient advocate yourself, somebody who's gone through this, what kind of words of wisdom or thoughts do you have about how we get the public to really engage in all of this, and also the medical community? I might add, one of the kind of watershed experiences for me recently was at the AMIA conference in November. One of the plenary speakers was E-Patient Dave, and he presented with his primary physician, who also had suddenly just become a patient himself. E-Patient Dave got a standing ovation, which I thought was really remarkable in a room full of mostly docs. But I think that there is, I'm still kind of noodling around this whole issue of how do we bring together the public, the patients, in a way that respects them, their autonomy, in a world in which we are all concerned about our privacy, and we're all concerned about.
I'll send you this draft that I sent to the New England Journal this week. You know, it's really interesting, right? Because for the most part, people want to do the right thing. So I think Moffitt did this best years ago. Moffitt Cancer Center down in Florida. They put in what I thought years ago. I spent several years, 08, during the Iraq War, 07 to 09, helping build this cancer center in Amman, Jordan. J&J allowed me to go a week a month for 2 years. And it was really fascinating. It was the only place in the Arab world that treated adults and children in one place. And it was really fascinating to see how they felt about research. They're like, what are we, rabbits? You know, you're gonna doing this? You know, and they really felt that way. They, you know, and I said, you know, it's actually quite different. I remember being on the stage, and I had an Islamic sheikh on one side and a Catholic priest on the other side. And whenever I was in Jordan, I always hung out with a Catholic priest because I could get a drink. Even during Ramadan, you can get a drink, right? Now we're rich Catholic boys, I can say that. But what was funny, I said, actually think about it a little differently. You have an amazing culture. No clinical trials have been done, which means you have never taken a drug that was tested in your people before it was given to your people. I said, and that might be something you want to think about the way you empower yourself. So relative to the patient thing, you've got this thing where our children currently, in an afternoon, probably spend more time on social media than they will ever spend in a room with a physician in their entire life of 15-minute increments, right? One day, they're running these studies now, so you've got that. What the Moffitt system showed was that you would get 100% compliance if you talk to people correctly. They did a video consent process. They had professional consenters. They had it in 20 different languages. Tom Brokaw did the intro, and they would sit down with a patient and really explain it to him, and every single patient donated their samples and data. And I think that study's been run 100 times, and the answer is properly informed people that trust who's doing it, they all feel safe about it. So I think the idea is the altruistic part. As one of the physicians in the Ask of it, I think that tends to drive it. I think there's that. I think that being able to do it effectively is something. I think that geography is a big deal. One of the reasons I like CancerLinQ is because I don't think, the mother of 2 in Fargo that's going through chemo has a chance to get into a clinical trial, but she should be able to get the protocol. There's a great innovative company called Mytrus, M-Y-T-U-R. They're a company that does clinical trials completely online. They work with you with your J&J, they set the protocol, they ship the med to your family doctor, they do the analytical, and you can do a clinical trial anywhere. You don't have to be here or someplace like that. So I think part of it is democratizing medical care and getting it out there. And I think you've got to see more people benefiting from it than being hurt by it. Because I think people are scared that it's going to be used against them getting a job. They're scared it's going to be used against them for insurance and things like that. And so I think that, as it's 3/4 of hospital workers don't think hospitals are being transparent about what really goes on. The public even more so. So I think it's going to be about e-patient Dave and Jamie Haywood, patients like me, and folks that step up and do it. There are pictures at NIH of me in my underwear. They blacked out my eyes because of the study I was in. I'm standing here like, you just got to do it with the right. You just got to turn around and say, I actually don't care, and it's the right thing to do. And by the way, it actually really helped me at that stage of my care to do that. I was 38. My daughter was less than 3 years old. I had stage 3 papillary RCC, Fermin grade 4. I statistically had less than a 30% chance of living 5 years, which instantly meant I thought that I had virtually no chance of seeing my daughter make 3rd grade. She's now in 7th grade, going straight to juvie. She's doing great. I'm perfectly fine. It's all good. But it's, at that point in time, you'll find people are looking for something that feels like they have some power or some recourse, because the loss of control is a really important thing that this, I think, is enabling for.
So thank you. Either I'll look for it in my email or I'll look for it in the press.
Great, thanks.
Thank you.
I think, sorry.
Gene, I think, has his hand up next, and then you.
Yeah, just getting back to technology a little bit.
Yeah.
In addition to just getting more data, getting better data and access to it, are there any data analysis or data representation needs that you think are really being met, like tools that aren't, or areas where tools are really needed?
I think the answer is absolutely. We don't have all we need. A lot of I think most people doing this stuff can get what they need open source or pretty easily. I think that the thing I talked about of folks that are trying to go from high content data like genomics to a phenotype and down, I think there's still a lot to do. I2B2 does great stuff with that. There's still a lot of work to be done in assessing that.
So being able to represent something like in a multi-scale level, like cellular up to larger, is that what you
the first pictures I showed, the ability to have people able to go in and get out of that stuff and get an idea. We know that physicians don't usually consider more than 2 to 3 things at once heavily in a decision. What happens when they've got 20? And by the way, they're all equally weighted. You should be giving each one of them 5% of your attention. Humans can't. So I think clinical decision support, CDS, I think some of the stuff that's out there is okay, but I think there's room in that market at all levels. So I think that one's pretty important. I also think that a lot of the velocity stuff we saw, Pete Corey does not know how they're going to do science with the data they're getting, because they want to go back. And I had lots of great friends at FDA and still did, but they were those great, what I call registry drug trial biostatisticians, the one that decide whether or not a drug should be approved, that can only think of I think they have to have five zeros in their p-value before they change the channel on their TV, right? We desperate, trust me, if you're taking a drug, you want these people reviewing the file. But there's a lot of questions where that will actually prohibit the science, because you're doing, you're trying to, I've got 500 hypotheses, which 5 do I do? It's kind of like figuring out which shipments to inspect. Signal detection is pore size, how big a net you want to throw. Signal management requires some insight and knowledge. When we brought that up, in some ways it was as simple as saying, you know what? Pre-cooked lobster tails from Vietnam usually show up stinky, so if there's pre-cooked lobster tails, you might want to inspect those. So history is an example of something that you'd use in those types of analytics. But there's lots of other things that can go in it as well. So no, I think that I think it's open-ended innovation, and I think it's about helping people come up with better questions.
Yeah.
I don't think it's a better way to look at a spreadsheet and some of these other things that are out there. I think it's ideas. Great question. Sir.
Oh yeah, so we did some work on the data sharing, and just look at the science of data sharing. So the other day we talked about the Department of Health, the Public Health of Pennsylvania. Yeah. They have a lot of different different databases about like immunization and SDT kind of thing. And the problems the data sharing, so from my experience is my background is data integrations in database. So there's two kinds of things. One is that to standardize the data, standardize data so data can come to the central repository. The second thing, actually, what the public health they have problem is actually identity matching. Yeah. So it's not about the standardization, about how to standardize each field, but it's about like in different databases, different hospital, different they report data, but they use different identifier to match.
Yeah, there's no universal patient ID.
So is there any, like, in your work, is there any good way to identify, like, record
I mean,
matching?
depending on what you're going to do, there's lots of good ways to do it. I've never met an EMR that wasn't full of pregnant males. Okay. Right, so surprising I'll say. Okay. I see them all the time, and I didn't do it. Yeah. Okay, I'll be really clear. I didn't know. But I've never met one that wasn't. So there's a lot of things. First and foremost, there's this neat and fuzzy thing. Right, so you know the neats and the fuzzies, right? I'm a declared fuzzy for most things, but I was at FDA doing neat stuff. So the idea here is that you can work with pretty dirty data to do some things. The identity thing is tough. Actually, Friday I was at the Mass Department of Public Health. We actually host at Harvard some of their epi, and they've got a mandate to make a bunch of data public. So I met with a bunch of the lawyers, because I did this at FDA, and helped them set that up. And it's really interesting. It's not just an identity problem. They are never going to release their HIV testing results. There is not a world in which they're letting that stuff out, because it has personal implications for people. The Rare Diseases Network that we're doing, which is really big, that NIH has done, we do full genetic sequencing in every one of these kids. How many times do you think we end up with the real parents in the room? And how many times they don't know it? A lot more than you think, because we instantly know paternity, and it ain't him. So there's a lot of stuff that goes on with this.
There's a great conversation.
Well, we flat out say it's actually in a lot of the consent forms. We've literally got that type of stuff explicitly written in. It's explicitly written in that there's certain things that we're not going to reveal, because otherwise it's a can of worms. It's a can. What if you didn't know it was this? Well, because it could be something else. It could be the type of thing where you say, look, this is the type of thing. It looks like it's Y-linked, but this isn't the father. So I can't tell what the possible future for your next child is going to be, because I don't have a father anymore. But I think it's a Y-linked problem. I know it's not going to affect your daughters. It gets very quickly into this. So there's lots of folks. The folks that work with EHRs, the folks at Partners Healthcare, I could refer you to some of them that are really good at this. Trying for this. We host 30 million, we host all of Aetna's data, and we broker it. So we have 30 million Aetna lives that they do. And so we kind of help them by running a consortium. And so the idea here is 80% is really good. Right. And at the same time, if you're doing a lot of drug research, you're probably more interested in phenotypes, views of a virtual patient, than having to know it's Bob in some of these other things. I actually don't want to know it's Bob. I want to know it's this blood work and those types of things. So no, there are lots of different ways that people do it, but they're all very imperfect. Would we ever get? I mean, this is why Iceland is so good. With their genealogies, and everybody was an axe murderer at some stage in their family over there. It's great to read their papers, because they've got it going back hundreds of years. Every national identifier. So yeah, but I think a lot of people move it out, and a lot of people, with ASCO, for example, we're splitting it out. We're going to do MP in kind of a different way. We're going to assign a patient identifier that totally separates the patient from their other data.
Do you know a sort of an open source lawyer? That's not an oxymoron. Name of Wilforce or Wilberforce?
John Wilbanks?
Yeah, Wilbanks.
I know him well.
Okay.
Yeah.
I
He's a
really.
good friend.
I like his ideas a lot.
If you don't know, John Wilbanks at Creative Commons.
Yeah.
And the Open Health, great
Why don't you
guy.
talk a little bit about him and why?
So he's working with us on this people-powered medicine thing. And what he's working on right now in the meetings I'm doing is he's really trying to enable universal, portable, ethical, informed consent. Why does every healthcare facility have to have a different informed consent form, an informed consent process, and a lot of these other things? So that's one of his big things right now is in getting to that, and obviously a patient identifier potentially. But you have to throw that on the other side of firewall depending on your IRB. But so John's doing great stuff. So I'm working with him as getting to this portable informed consent thing. You know, one of those times when you wake up in your career to like, oh, I'm actually having a very different conversation than what I thought I was having. We, about 5 or 6 years ago in our cancer trials at J&J, and I won't name names, we started getting pushback from IRBs on our consent forms. And our consent forms were actually pretty standard. It was, do we have permission to use your data for you and your disease, and for patients that have your cancer, and often it was, and for other cancers. We didn't usually go for it, but it was usually other cancers, or it was other digestive cancers, other respiratory cancers. It was a reasonable region. We started getting those kicked back. And you know, so we got the ethics people, and why are these sites kicking these things back to us? And so you start chasing it down, and everyone's, what's wrong with these forms? Long story short, when you finally find someone who says, it was actually that these particular clinical sites actually wanted to retain the rights to the data and the samples there so they could sell it.
There you go.
So they were kicking back so we're chasing. They sent us on a merry chase here about the totally the wrong thing, and this is their IRB. This is their institutional review board. You know, I'm not saying it was a plot because it wasn't. It was clearly a few folks that were.
Yeah.
You do, but I mean, it gets really, really complex. So having uniform, informed consent, I think will help data advocacy. I think it will help data privacy, and I think it will be an accelerant to getting people available to trials, because there is a large liability here with handling patients' data even after they consent. I got to tell. Remember, I said there's a few bad guys and people make mistakes. I used to supervise lots of clinical sites in J&J. You know, the number of times, you know, you pull up an email. I'm going to email David. I start to type David or Fensky, and it pulls up, and I said, yeah. You know how many nurses have sent patient records to someone's Gmail account because they pulled up a doctor's name that way? This is a third shift nurse, not the devil. You know, not trying to do anything wrong, and creates a HIPAA violation that could cost $2 million just because of something as simple as that. You know, so David's working on taking the foolishness and the liability out of some of these things to push the sociology forward. Really, really, he was supportive of partnering for cures. I can send the video of, if nothing else, it's kind of funny to see Jesse, Dylan, and I sitting, we're kind of opposites sitting next to each other. He's a great guy.
That'd be great. I appreciate all that shared information. Do we have a last question here so we can let this man, we can thank this man properly for a very informative afternoon? Well, then I think we should.
Thank you.